Welcome to Wisdom. Relax, close your eyes. You can drift off. Let the story carry you to sleep.
Our story continues now in the year 364 AD, a time when the Roman Empire stood at yet another crossroads in its long and troubled history. The reign of Julian the Apostate had ended in the sands of Mesopotamia, his ambitious campaign against the Sasanian Persians concluding with his death from a battle wound, and the dreams of pagan restoration dying with him on that distant battlefield. The brief rule of Jovian that followed had done little to steady the ship of state, and when Jovian himself died unexpectedly after only 8 months on the throne, the empire found itself once again without a clear successor. The soldiers and officials who gathered to choose a new emperor understood that they needed a strong hand, a military man who could defend the vast frontiers while managing the complex religious tensions that had come to define imperial politics in this turbulent age. That man would be Valentinian, a soldier from the province of Pannonia who would establish a dynasty bearing his name and reshape the administrative structure of the Roman world in ways that would endure for generations. Valentinian I was born Flavius Valentinianus on the 3rd of July in the year 321 AD, in the region of Pannonia along the Middle Danube, where the empire met the endless forests and plains of the barbarian north. His father had been a military officer of modest origins, a man named Gratian the Elder who had risen through the ranks by talent and determination rather than noble birth or aristocratic connection. The family possessed no ancient lineage, no ties to the great senatorial houses of Rome or the imperial dynasties that had preceded them. They were soldiers, plain and simple, men who had earned their positions through years of hard service on the frontiers of empire where Roman civilization gave way to the wild lands beyond. The young Valentinian followed his father into military service as naturally as breathing, learning the harsh lessons of frontier warfare in the garrisons and camps that dotted the empire's northern boundaries like beads on a string. He grew into a formidable soldier, broad-shouldered and fierce-tempered, with a reputation for both physical courage in battle and brutal discipline in camp that would follow him throughout his career. Those who served under him learned quickly that competence was rewarded and failure punished with equal certainty. There was nothing subtle about Valentinian, nothing of the philosopher or the courtier. He was a man of direct action and plain speech, more comfortable in the saddle than on a throne, more at ease among soldiers than senators. When the army gathered to choose a new emperor after Jovian's sudden death in February of 364, their choice fell upon this proven warrior. Valentinian was 43 years old, experienced in command, and respected by the troops who had served alongside him through years of hard campaigning along the empire's troubled frontiers. The circumstances of his election reflected the changed nature of imperial power in the 4th century. It was not the Senate in Rome that elevated him to the purple, nor any formal constitutional process, but rather the acclamation of soldiers gathered at Nicaea in the east. The army had become the true kingmaker of the Roman world, and Valentinian understood this reality better than most. Within weeks of his accession, he made a decision that would shape the empire's future for generations to come. He elevated his younger brother Valens to the rank of co-emperor and Augustus, assigning him responsibility for the eastern provinces, while Valentinian himself would rule the west from courts closer to the troubled northern frontiers. This division of labor between the brothers created a durable administrative framework that anticipated the later permanent separation of the Roman world into eastern and western halves. Valentinian and Valens would rule as colleagues, theoretically equal in dignity and authority, though the elder brother retained primacy in practice. They divided the armies, the treasuries, and the bureaucracies between them, creating two parallel imperial establishments that would increasingly develop their own distinct characters over time. The brothers met only rarely after this initial division, each consumed by the challenges of his own territories. It was a practical arrangement born of stark necessity, an acknowledgement that the empire had grown too vast and faced too many simultaneous threats for any single ruler to manage effectively. Valentinian established his court not in Rome but in the cities of the north, primarily Milan and later Trier in Gaul, positioning himself closer to the frontiers that demanded his constant attention. The Eternal City had long since ceased to be the practical center of imperial power. Its population remained vast, its monuments awe-inspiring, but its strategic importance had diminished as the center of gravity shifted to the threatened borderlands. What mattered now were the Rhine and the Danube, the great rivers that marked the boundary between Roman civilization and the Germanic peoples who pressed ever more insistently against those ancient barriers. The military campaigns of Valentinian's reign were relentless and exhausting, a constant struggle to maintain positions that earlier emperors had secured with such difficulty. Along the Rhine, he faced the Alemanni, a powerful confederation of Germanic tribes who had grown bold during the chaos of recent decades. Valentinian responded with characteristic energy, strengthening fortifications along the river, launching punitive expeditions across into Germanic territory, and working to restore the iron discipline that frontier armies required if they were to hold the line. He built new forts and watchtowers, repaired roads and bridges that had fallen into disrepair, and ensured that the supply lines connecting his scattered forces remained secure and functional through all seasons. On the Danube, he contended with the Quadi and Sarmatians, peoples who tested Roman defenses with raids and incursions that kept the frontier in constant turmoil. Year after year, the emperor took personal command of his forces, leading from the front as the great soldier emperors of old had done. He won no spectacular victories that would echo through history, achieved no conquests that would expand the empire's boundaries or add new provinces to its already overstretched administration. His was the unglamorous work of defense, of holding lines that others had drawn, of ensuring that the fabric of Roman power did not unravel further under the relentless pressure of peoples who sensed weakness and smelled opportunity in every Roman setback. In matters of religion, Valentinian pursued a policy that stood in marked contrast to his immediate predecessors. He was himself a Christian, baptized and genuinely believing, but he showed little interest in the theological disputes that had consumed so much imperial energy under Constantius and Julian. Rather than favoring one faction over another in the great controversy between Nicene and Arian interpretations of Christian doctrine, he maintained a general tolerance that allowed both groups to practice their faith. He refrained from harsh anti-pagan legislation, his focus remaining fixed on military and administrative matters while leaving bishops and theologians to settle their own quarrels. The emperor's family arrangements reflected the political calculations that inevitably surrounded the imperial succession in an age when disputed transfers of power so often led to civil war and chaos. His first wife gave him a son, Gratian, who was elevated to the rank of Augustus while still a child, ensuring the continuity of the new Valentinian dynasty and providing a clear heir whom the armies and officials could rally around. A second marriage produced another son, Valentinian II, who would also wear the purple in time. These careful preparations reflected the hard-won wisdom of a century of civil wars and usurpations, an understanding that the empire's stability depended on clear succession plans that left little room for ambitious generals or discontented factions to challenge the established order. For 11 years, Valentinian held the Western Empire together through sheer force of will and tireless military competence, never resting, never allowing the frontiers to collapse despite the constant pressure from peoples who saw in every Roman difficulty a chance for their own advancement. He was not a beloved emperor, not a figure who inspired great affection or loyalty beyond what his position commanded. He was respected, even feared, but rarely loved. His harshness alienated many, and his single-minded focus on military matters left little energy for the cultural and civic life that had once defined Roman greatness. The end came suddenly in November of 375, as sudden endings so often did for Roman emperors, though not by assassination or defeat in battle. The emperor was at Brigesio on the Danube, meeting with envoys from the Quadi who had come to discuss terms after their latest incursion into Roman territory. The negotiations grew heated, and the barbarian ambassadors proved insolent in their demands. Valentinian's famous temper, always simmering beneath the surface, flared beyond all control. According to the ancient sources, he flew into such a violent rage that the blood rushed to his head with terrible force. He suffered a stroke right there in the audience chamber, collapsing before his horrified attendants who could do nothing but watch in helpless dismay. He died within hours, carried off by the very fury that had driven him throughout his career. He was 54 years old, and his death would leave the Western Empire in the hands of his young sons while far greater challenges gathered on the eastern horizon. While Valentinian defended the western frontiers with such determination, his younger brother Valens faced challenges of his own in the eastern half of the empire. Valens had been born in the year 328 AD, raised in the same military traditions that had shaped his elder brother, though he lacked some of Valentinian's natural authority and commanding presence. When the brothers divided the empire between them in 364, Valens received the eastern provinces, ruling from Constantinople over the wealthy lands of the Balkans, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. It was a vast domain, rich in resources and ancient in civilization, but it faced threats that would prove even more dangerous than those Valentinian confronted along the Rhine and Danube. The early years of Valens's reign were consumed by a usurpation that tested his hold on power. Procopius, a relative of the Emperor Julian who had been passed over in the succession, raised a rebellion in Constantinople itself in 365, claiming the throne and briefly controlling significant portions of the Eastern Empire. Valens responded with characteristic stubbornness, gathering loyal forces and pursuing the usurper until Procopius was betrayed by his own followers and killed in 366. The rebellion's suppression demonstrated that Valens could defend his position when challenged, but it also revealed the fragility of imperial authority in an age when any ambitious general with a claim, however tenuous, might try his luck against the established order. With the Procopian threat eliminated, Valens turned his attention to the frontiers, where the Sasanian Persians remained the empire's most formidable adversary in the east. The long conflict between Rome and Persia stretched back centuries, a struggle for dominance in Armenia and Mesopotamia that neither side had ever quite managed to resolve definitively. Under Valens, this rivalry continued in its familiar pattern of skirmishes, negotiations, and occasional campaigns that shifted boundaries without fundamentally altering the balance of power between the two great empires of the ancient world. In religious matters, Valens differed significantly from his brother's tolerant approach. While Valentinian maintained neutrality in the disputes between Nicene and Arian Christianity, Valens actively favored the Arian position, using imperial power to promote Arian clergy and to pressure Nicene bishops who resisted his theological preferences. He exiled prominent Nicene churchmen, confiscated church properties, and created bitter divisions within Christian communities that would take generations to heal. This partisan involvement in religious controversy alienated many of his subjects and contributed to the negative reputation he would carry in later Christian historical traditions, which were largely written from the Nicene perspective. But the true crisis of Valens's reign came not from Persia or from internal religious disputes. It came from the steppes of Central Asia, from a people the Romans had never encountered before and barely understood. The Huns, nomadic warriors of terrifying effectiveness, had swept westward across the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea, smashing the Gothic kingdoms that had stood as a buffer between the Roman frontier and the peoples beyond. The Goths, themselves formidable warriors who had long troubled the empire's Danubian provinces, suddenly found themselves refugees, fleeing before an enemy they could not defeat. In 376, an enormous mass of Gothic refugees appeared on the northern bank of the Danube, begging permission to cross into Roman territory and find safety within the empire's protected borders. They numbered in the hundreds of thousands according to some estimates, entire peoples uprooted from their ancestral lands and homes, desperate for safety and survival after the Hunnic onslaught had destroyed everything they had known. Valens, seeing both a humanitarian crisis and an opportunity, granted them permission to enter the empire as foederati, allied peoples who would receive land in exchange for military service. He imagined them as future soldiers for Roman armies always hungry for recruits, as farmers who might cultivate lands that had lain abandoned since earlier plagues and wars, as taxpayers who might help fill the depleted imperial coffers. It seemed a reasonable calculation at the time, a way to turn a crisis into an advantage for the empire. But the reality proved far different from these hopeful imaginings in almost every conceivable way. The Roman officials charged with receiving and settling the Goths proved corrupt and incompetent, more interested in profiting from the refugees' desperation than in integrating them peacefully into imperial society as productive subjects. They sold food at extortionate prices to starving people who had no other options. They seized children as slaves in exchange for scraps of dog meat. They treated the Gothic warriors and their families with contempt and cruelty that transformed grateful refugees into bitter enemies, nursing grievances that demanded satisfaction. Within 2 years of their crossing, the Goths had risen in full revolt against their Roman hosts, and the Balkans descended into a chaos of fire and sword. The Roman response to this Gothic uprising proved woefully inadequate in every respect. Field armies sent against the rebels were outmaneuvered and defeated by warriors who had everything to fight for and nothing left to lose. Attempts at negotiation failed because neither side trusted the other after so many betrayals and broken promises. The Goths, now fighting for their very survival against an empire that had so thoroughly broken faith with them, proved far more formidable opponents than the Romans had anticipated when they first admitted these desperate refugees. They raided throughout Thrace and Macedonia, destroying farms and villages, defeating every force sent against them, and growing stronger as they captured Roman weapons and supplies. By 378, the situation had grown so dire that Valens himself took the field at the head of the main imperial army. He marched from the east with every soldier he could muster, determined to crush the Gothic revolt once and for all and restore order to his ravaged provinces. His nephew Gratian, now Western emperor following Valentinian's death 3 years earlier, was bringing reinforcements from the west, and prudent counsel from experienced advisors urged Valens to wait for these additional forces before engaging the enemy in pitched battle. The Goths were formidable, but a combined Eastern and Western army would possess overwhelming strength. But Valens was impatient, jealous perhaps of sharing glory with his young nephew, confident in his own army's strength, and eager to prove that he needed no help to deal with barbarian rebels. Reports suggested the Gothic force was smaller than expected, perhaps no more than 10,000 warriors. On the 9th of August in 378, near the city of Adrianople in Thrace, with the summer heat bearing down and his soldiers weary from their march, Valens ordered an attack without waiting for Gratian's arrival. The Battle of Adrianople became one of the great disasters in Roman military history, a catastrophe that would echo through the centuries and mark a turning point in the empire's long struggle for survival. The Gothic cavalry, whose arrival on the battlefield the Romans had not anticipated or prepared for, swept around the Roman flanks and struck the closely packed legions from unexpected directions. The Roman infantry, arrayed in their traditional formations, but packed too tightly together to maneuver effectively in the face of this unexpected threat, found themselves surrounded on all sides and cut down in terrible numbers. 2/3 of the Eastern Field Army perished on that terrible afternoon beneath the hot August sun, along with many of the empire's most experienced commanders and administrators who had accompanied the emperor to the front. And among the dead lay Valens himself, killed either in the desperate fighting or in a farmhouse where he had taken refuge with his wounded bodyguard, and which the Goths surrounded and set ablaze, unwilling to let any of their enemies escape. His body was never definitively recovered from the ashes and carnage. The defeat at Adrianople shocked the Roman world to its very core and sent tremors of fear through every province. Not since Cannae, more than 5 centuries earlier when Hannibal had destroyed a Roman army in Italy, had a Roman force suffered such a catastrophic and complete defeat at the hands of a foreign enemy. The loss went far beyond the immediate casualties, as devastating as those were in human terms. The empire had lost an experienced army that could not be quickly replaced, had lost the commanders and senior officers whose expertise and institutional knowledge had taken decades to develop, had lost confidence in its ability to defend itself against barbarian enemies who now seemed to hold the advantage in open battle. The Goths remained inside the empire, undefeated and now more dangerous than ever, a roaming army that no surviving Roman force seemed capable of stopping or even containing. The death of Valens left the eastern throne vacant at the worst possible moment. Gratian, now responsible for the entire empire by default, recognized that he could not manage both halves simultaneously while also dealing with the Gothic crisis. He needed a partner, a capable military commander, who could take charge in the east and salvage what could be salvaged from the disaster his uncle had created. His choice would prove momentous for the future of the Roman world and for the relationship between Roman power and the Christian faith. Gratian, the young Western emperor who now faced the daunting task of managing the Gothic crisis and finding a new ruler for the East, had been born in the year 359, the son of Valentinian I by his first wife. He had been made co-emperor as a child of 8, learning the duties of rulership under his father's watchful eye while protected from the dangerous realities of power by that same strong presence. When Valentinian died so suddenly in 375, Gratian found himself at 16 the senior emperor of the Roman world, sharing nominal authority with his young half-brother Valentinian II, but bearing the real weight of Western governance on shoulders barely old enough to carry a soldier's equipment. The young emperor had shown promise in his early years, displaying intelligence and a genuine commitment to the Christian faith that had become so central to imperial identity. He studied with the great Bishop Ambrose of Milan, absorbing not only theological learning, but also a passionate conviction that the empire's future depended on its alliance with the Orthodox Christian Church. Under Ambrose's influence, Gratian would pursue religious policies far more aggressive than his father's tolerant neutrality, actively working to suppress paganism and to establish Nicene Christianity as the sole legitimate faith of the Roman state. In 382, Gratian took the momentous step of removing the ancient altar of victory from the Roman Senate house, where it had stood for centuries as a symbol of Rome's traditional religion and the divine favor that had made the city great. Conservative senators protested vigorously, arguing that abandoning the gods who had protected Rome for so long invited disaster. But Gratian, guided by Ambrose and convinced that only the Christian God deserved Roman worship, refused to restore the altar. It was a decisive moment in the long transformation of the Roman world from pagan to Christian, a clear signal that the old ways would find no protection from imperial power. But Gratian's most consequential decision came in the immediate aftermath of Adrianople. The Eastern Empire needed an emperor, a capable military commander, who could salvage the situation in the Balkans and restore order to provinces devastated by years of Gothic raiding. Gratian's choice fell upon Theodosius, the son of a distinguished general who had served Valentinian I with great success before falling victim to court intrigue and execution. The younger Theodosius had retired to his Spanish estates after his father's death, but his military reputation remained strong, and Gratian summoned him from retirement to take command of the East. Theodosius was born in the year 347 in the province of Hispania, in that same Iberian peninsula that had produced emperors before and would produce them again. His father, also named Theodosius, had been one of Valentinian's most effective generals, winning victories in Britain and Africa before jealous rivals engineered his downfall. The son had served alongside the father, learning the soldiers' trade in campaigns across the empire before withdrawing to private life when his father's execution made imperial service too dangerous. Now, at 32 years old, he received the summons that would make him one of the most influential emperors in Roman history. Theodosius arrived in the East in 379 to find a situation of desperate crisis that would have daunted any leader. The Gothic confederations roamed freely through the provinces of Thrace, their power unbroken despite the death of their greatest enemy at Adrianople, their warriors emboldened by victory and enriched by plunder. The remnants of the Eastern army could barely defend the cities and strongholds that remained in Roman hands, lacking the strength for offensive operations against enemies who had proven their superiority in open battle. Resources were scarce after years of devastation and disrupted taxation. Morale was shattered among soldiers who had seen their comrades slaughtered and their emperor killed. And many wondered, in whispered conversations behind closed doors, whether the Eastern Empire could survive at all, or whether this was the beginning of the end of Roman power in these ancient lands. The new emperor responded with a combination of military rebuilding and diplomatic flexibility that gradually, painfully stabilized the situation over the following years. He recruited new soldiers from wherever he could find them, including many barbarians who were willing to serve in Roman armies for pay and the promise of land. He strengthened fortifications around key cities, transforming urban centers into defensible strongholds that could resist Gothic attacks. He refused to risk another pitched battle until his forces had recovered their strength and confidence, accepting the humiliation of a defensive posture in exchange for the time he needed to rebuild. And crucially, he negotiated with the Gothic leaders, seeking terms that might transform them from mortal enemies into something more manageable. The Goths had proven they could not be defeated by the forces currently available. Perhaps they could be accommodated, given what they wanted in exchange for peace and service. In 382, Theodosius concluded a treaty with the Goths that represented a new departure in Roman policy. Instead of defeating them or expelling them, he settled them within the empire as foederati, allied peoples who would provide military service in exchange for land in Thrace and annual payments from the imperial treasury. The Goths would live under their own laws, governed by their own chiefs, while owing loyalty to the emperor and fighting in his armies when called. It was a practical solution to an impossible situation, but it established a precedent that would have far-reaching consequences, creating autonomous barbarian communities within the empire's borders that owed allegiance to Rome but were not truly Roman. In religious matters, Theodosius proved as zealous as Gratian in promoting Nicene Christianity and suppressing its rivals, indeed perhaps more so given the intensity of his personal conviction. The Edict of Thessalonica, issued in 380 shortly after his arrival in the East, declared Nicene Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire and branded all other beliefs, Christian and pagan alike, as heresy punishable by imperial law. It was a remarkable document, asserting in clear and uncompromising language that the emperor expected all his subjects to follow the faith defined by the councils of the Church, particularly the Council of Nicaea, and that those who refused would face the consequences of both divine judgment and earthly penalty. Arians, who had enjoyed imperial favor and protection under Valens, now found themselves persecuted and marginalized, their bishops expelled from their churches, their congregations stripped of legal standing. Pagans faced increasingly severe restrictions on their traditional practices, with temples closed by imperial order, animal sacrifices banned as criminal acts, and the ancient priesthood stripped of their remaining privileges and the public funding that had sustained them for centuries. The eternal flames that had burned in temples across the empire were extinguished one by one. The festivals that had marked the Roman year since time immemorial were suppressed or transformed into Christian celebrations. Under Theodosius, the Christian transformation of the Roman state reached its decisive and irreversible phase, and the old gods retreated into shadow and memory. The relationship between Theodosius and Gratian remained cooperative through the early years of the former's eastern reign. They corresponded regularly, coordinated military policy, and shared a commitment to Orthodox Christianity that gave their partnership an ideological foundation. Gratian continued his own religious program in the West, working with Ambrose to establish Christian dominance over the old pagan order. But the young Western emperor's position was growing precarious, undermined by resentments and ambitions that would soon tear his reign apart. Gratian had always been more comfortable with books and theology than with the rough military culture that had been his father's world. He surrounded himself with advisors who shared his intellectual interests, alienating officers and soldiers who felt excluded from imperial favor. More dangerously, he showed favoritism toward certain barbarian units in his army, particularly a group of Alan warriors whose exotic customs and special status bred jealousy among other troops. These grievances accumulated quietly through the early 380s, waiting for a spark to ignite them into open rebellion. That spark came in 383 when Maximus, a general of Spanish origin commanding Roman forces in Britain, was proclaimed emperor by his troops in one of those military coups that had become so grimly familiar in Roman history. Maximus crossed the Channel to Gaul with an army of British legions, and the soldiers who should have defended Gratian against this usurper instead defected to the challenger in alarming numbers. They had grown tired of their emperor's scholarly interests and his favoritism toward barbarian units, and they saw in Maximus a traditional Roman commander who understood and valued their service. Gratian fled the approaching rebel army, abandoned by the men who had sworn to protect him with their lives, and was captured and killed in August of 383 at Lugdunum in Gaul. He was only 24 years old, and his death left the Western Empire divided between the usurper Maximus and the child Valentinian II, who survived only because Theodosius in the East was not yet ready to confront the man who had murdered his colleague and fellow emperor. Theodosius bided his time after Gratian's murder, accepting Maximus as a colleague in the West rather than immediately challenging him with military force. The Eastern Emperor had enough problems of his own to manage without adding a civil war to his burdens, and young Valentinian II still held Italy and Africa under Maximus's grudging tolerance. For several years, this awkward arrangement persisted, three emperors sharing a world that could barely support two, while tensions simmered beneath a surface of diplomatic courtesy and formal recognition. The breaking point came in 387 when Maximus moved against Valentinian, invading Italy and forcing the young emperor to flee to the east and throw himself on Theodosius's protection. Now there could be no more accommodation, no more diplomatic fiction of shared rule. Theodosius gathered his armies, including the Gothic foederati whose settlement he had negotiated, and marched west to confront the usurper. The campaign of 388 was swift and decisive. Theodosius's forces defeated Maximus at battles in Pannonia and northern Italy, and the usurper himself was captured and executed, his brief reign ending as so many usurpers' reigns had ended, in blood and failure. Theodosius restored Valentinian II to the Western throne, but the young emperor was merely a puppet in the hands of the powerful general Arbogast, a Frank who had risen high in Roman service, and who now controlled the Western armies and, through them, the Western government. Valentinian chafed under this domination, but when he tried to assert himself, he died under mysterious circumstances in 392, officially a suicide but widely suspected to be murder arranged by Arbogast. The general, unable to claim the throne himself because of his barbarian origin, elevated a rhetorician named Eugenius as his puppet emperor, and once again the Roman world faced civil war. Theodosius responded with another Western campaign, this time against an enemy who rallied significant pagan support to his cause. Eugenius and his backers represented, among other things, a last attempt by the old pagan aristocracy of Rome to reverse the Christian tide that had been sweeping away their ancient religion. They restored the altar of victory that Gratian had removed. They funded traditional cults and temples. They gathered around themselves all those who still honored the gods of their ancestors. The conflict took on the character of a religious war, Christian empire against pagan reaction, the new faith against the old. The decisive battle came at the Frigidus River in September of 394, a two-day struggle that began badly for Theodosius when his initial assault was repulsed with heavy losses. Many of the Gothic foederati died in that first day's fighting, sent forward as shock troops in what some historians have interpreted as a deliberate attempt to weaken them while they weakened the enemy. But on the second day, whether through tactical skill, good fortune, or divine intervention as Christian sources claimed, Theodosius's forces broke through. Eugenius was captured and executed, Arbogast fled and committed suicide, and Theodosius became sole ruler of the entire Roman Empire, the last man who would ever hold both East and West in his single grasp. His sole reign lasted only a few months, a brief moment of unified authority that would never be repeated. In January of 395, Theodosius died at Milan, reportedly from a disease described by ancient physicians as edema or dropsy, his body weakened by years of campaigning and the accumulated stress of governing an empire in perpetual crisis. He was 48 years old, not exceptionally old by the standards of his time, but worn down by the burdens he had carried. He had accomplished much in his 16 years as emperor, achievements that would shape the Roman world for generations to come. He had preserved the Eastern Empire through its greatest crisis since the 3rd century, navigating the aftermath of Adrianople with patience and pragmatism. He had established the Gothic foederati as a permanent feature of imperial defense, creating a new model for incorporating barbarian peoples into the Roman military system, even if that model contained dangers of its own. He had made Nicene Christianity the official and exclusive religion of the Roman state, completing the religious transformation that Constantine had begun and creating the Christian empire that would endure in the East for another 1,000 years. He had defeated 2 dangerous usurpers to reunify the empire under legitimate rule, demonstrating that the imperial system could still produce capable leaders who could overcome challenges through military skill and political acumen. And he had also, in one of his most famous moments, submitted to public penance imposed by Bishop Ambrose of Milan after a massacre of civilians at Thessalonica, a terrible act of vengeance that Ambrose condemned as unworthy of a Christian ruler. The emperor had accepted the bishop's judgment, had done public penance before the doors of the cathedral, establishing a precedent for ecclesiastical authority over even imperial power that would have profound implications for the relationship between church and state throughout the medieval centuries. But perhaps Theodosius's most consequential decision was his last. On his deathbed, he divided the empire between his 2 sons, giving the east to Arcadius and the west to Honorius. It was not an unusual arrangement by the standards of 4th century practice, this sharing of imperial power between brothers, or between father and son. Yet this particular division would prove permanent. Never again would a single emperor rule both halves of the Roman world in any meaningful sense. The year 395 marks the final separation of East and West into distinct political entities that would evolve along increasingly divergent paths until the Western Empire ceased to exist entirely. Arcadius, the elder son who received the Eastern Empire, had been born in 377, which made him about 18 years old when he became sole ruler of Constantinople and the wealthy provinces of the East. He had been raised in the purple, surrounded by eunuchs and courtiers, educated in the ceremonial duties of imperial office, but sheltered from the harsh realities of military command and political struggle. He was by all accounts a passive and malleable young man, more interested in religious devotion and palace routine than in the active governance that the times demanded. Real power during his reign would be exercised by others, a succession of powerful ministers and relatives who used the emperor as a legitimizing figurehead while pursuing their own ambitions. The early years of Arcadius's reign saw a power struggle between various factions at the Constantinople court. The most prominent figure was Rufinus, the Praetorian prefect of the East who had served Theodosius, and who now aspired to control the new emperor entirely. But Rufinus's ambitions were cut short when he was murdered by soldiers, reportedly at the instigation of Stilicho, the half-vandal general who controlled the Western armies under Honorius. The power vacuum was filled by the eunuch Eutropius, who accumulated unprecedented influence before he too fell victim to palace intrigue and was executed in 399. Eventually, the strongest influence over Arcadius became his wife Eudoxia, a woman of strong personality who bore him several children and who involved herself actively in the religious controversies of the day. She clashed memorably with John Chrysostom, the eloquent patriarch of Constantinople, whose sermons sometimes seemed to criticize imperial luxury and feminine vanity. The conflict between empress and patriarch ended with Chrysostom's exile and death, one of many episodes that revealed how religious and political power had become inextricably intertwined in the Christian Roman state that Theodosius had created. Despite the chaos at court, the Eastern Empire under Arcadius managed to preserve its essential integrity. The Goths who had been settled as foederati caused periodic problems, but were generally directed westward, toward Italy and the domains of Honorius, rather than being allowed to devastate the wealthy provinces of the East. Constantinople remained secure behind its walls, its population fed by grain from Egypt, its treasury filled by taxes from Asia Minor and Syria. The bureaucracy continued to function, the armies held the frontiers, and the Christian church flourished under imperial patronage. The East was finding its footing, developing the distinctive character that would eventually define the Byzantine civilization of later centuries. Arcadius died in 408, at the age of 31, leaving behind a 7-year-old son named Theodosius, who would rule as Theodosius II for the next 4 decades and leave his own mark on Roman history. The elder Arcadius's reign had been unspectacular by any measure, marked by court intrigue and factional struggles rather than great military deeds or memorable reforms. He had been a figurehead more than a ruler, his passive personality allowing stronger personalities to govern in his name while he performed the ceremonial duties that his position required. Yet in his own way, Arcadius had presided over a crucial transition period during which the Eastern Empire established patterns of governance and survival that would serve it well in the difficult centuries ahead. The bureaucracy learned to function regardless of who sat on the throne. The Church became ever more deeply woven into the fabric of state and society. Constantinople grew in population and magnificence, increasingly confident in its role as the new center of Roman civilization. The challenges facing his brother Honorius in the West, however, were proving far more severe and far less amenable to the solutions that worked in the East. The Western Empire that Honorius inherited in 395 faced dangers that would have tested the ablest of rulers, and Honorius was anything but able. He had been born in 384, which made him only 10 years old when his father's death placed the purple upon his narrow shoulders. Like his brother Arcadius in the east, he had been raised in the sheltered environment of the imperial court, surrounded by servants and tutors who taught him the ceremonial aspects of rulership while shielding him from its harsher realities. Unlike the East, however, the West had no cushion of wealth and strategic depth to compensate for a weak emperor. The challenges it faced required active and capable leadership, and Honorius could provide neither. Real power in the Western Empire lay with Stilicho, the half-Vandal general who had served Theodosius loyally, and who now served his son as Magister Militum, commander of all Western forces. Stilicho was a man of genuine ability and ambition, a skilled military leader who defended Italy against multiple threats during the early years of Honorius's reign. He also had dynastic aspirations, marrying his daughter to Honorius and positioning himself as the indispensable protector of the imperial house. For more than a decade, he was effectively the ruler of the West, with Honorius serving as little more than a figurehead who performed ceremonial duties, while Stilicho managed the actual business of defense and governance. The greatest threat facing the West was Alaric and his Visigoths, the same Gothic people whose ancestors had defeated Valens at Adrianople. Alaric had served in Roman armies, had fought for Theodosius at the Frigidus, but he nursed grievances against the empire and ambitions for his people that Roman policy seemed designed to frustrate rather than accommodate. He wanted official recognition, a Roman military command, land for his followers, regular supplies from imperial stores. When these demands went unsatisfied, he turned to violence, leading his warriors in raids that devastated the Balkans and eventually brought them into Italy itself. Stilicho managed to check Alaric's incursions several times, defeating him in battle or maneuvering him into unfavorable positions that forced retreat. But he never destroyed the Gothic army, never eliminated the threat definitively. Some historians have suspected that Stilicho saw in Alaric a useful tool for his own political purposes, a threat that justified his continued power and that might be directed against the Eastern Empire should the opportunity arise. Whether through design or inability, the Gothic menace remained, growing stronger as more warriors joined Alaric's band and as Roman defeats elsewhere freed up additional barbarian groups to seek their fortunes in the weakening western provinces. The crisis intensified dramatically in the winter of 406 to 407, when a massive migration of Vandals, Alans, and Sueves crossed the frozen Rhine into Gaul near the city of Mogontiacum. This was no mere raid by a few thousand warriors seeking plunder before returning to their homelands. It was a true migration, entire peoples on the move with their families and livestock, their wagons and possessions, seeking new homes in the Roman provinces that had seemed so wealthy and so vulnerable. The frontier defenses, stripped of troops to meet threats elsewhere, could not stop them or even significantly slow their advance. The Germanic peoples swept across Gaul in a wave of destruction, pillaging cities and villages, overwhelming local garrisons, and eventually crossing the Pyrenees into Spain, where they established themselves in provinces that had been Roman for 4 centuries. Britain, isolated by the Channel and unable to receive reinforcements from an empire that could not defend itself, effectively broke away from imperial control around the same time. Its garrison proclaimed a series of usurpers before the island was finally abandoned to its own defenses. In a few terrible years, the Western Empire lost control of vast territories that it would never recover, and the tax revenues and military manpower those territories had provided were lost forever. Stilicho's position became untenable as these disasters accumulated, and the empire he was supposed to defend crumbled around him. His enemies at court, always numerous among those who resented his power and his barbarian ancestry, found their opportunity in 408. They persuaded the weak and frightened Honorius that Stilicho was plotting treason, perhaps planning to place his own son on the throne. The emperor authorized his arrest, and Stilicho, perhaps hoping to avoid civil war, or perhaps simply paralyzed by the betrayal, allowed himself to be taken and executed. His murder removed the only capable defender the Western Empire possessed at the moment of its greatest danger. With Stilicho gone, anti-barbarian sentiment at the Roman court exploded into violence. The families of barbarian soldiers serving in the Roman army were massacred, driving thousands of warriors who had been loyal to Rome into Alaric's camp. The Gothic king, his army now swollen with deserters and his demands still unsatisfied, turned his attention to Italy with new determination. He had negotiated with Stilicho, had been on the verge of reaching an accommodation that might have made him a Roman general rather than a Roman enemy. Now there was no one left to negotiate with, only a frightened emperor cowering behind the walls of Ravenna and a court consumed by factional hatred and fear. Alaric marched on Rome itself in 408, besieging the ancient capital and demanding enormous payments in gold and silver as the price of withdrawal. The city, its population swollen by refugees from the countryside and its food supplies cut off, faced starvation. The Senate paid what Alaric demanded, stripping gold from temples and melting down statues that had stood for centuries. Alaric withdrew, but the fundamental issues remained unresolved. He still wanted what he had always wanted, legitimate Roman recognition and provision for his people, and Honorius's government remained incapable of either satisfying these demands or defeating him in battle. Twice more Alaric besieged Rome as negotiations dragged on and broke down. He set up a puppet emperor, he abandoned that emperor, he tried once more to reach terms with Honorius. But the emperor, safe behind the marshes and walls of Ravenna, refused all reasonable accommodation. Perhaps he was too weak to overrule the anti-barbarian faction at his court. Perhaps he was too stupid to understand the danger. Perhaps he simply did not care what happened to Rome as long as his own person remained secure. On the 24th of August in 410, Alaric finally lost patience with negotiations that led nowhere and with an emperor who seemed incapable of making any decision at all. His Visigoths entered Rome through the Salarian Gate on the northeastern side of the city, aided perhaps by slaves within the walls who saw in the barbarians liberators rather than invaders, who hoped that new masters might treat them better than the old ones had. For 3 days, the Goths sacked the city that had ruled the Mediterranean world for centuries, the city whose legions had conquered nations and whose laws had governed millions. They plundered churches and palaces, breaking open treasure houses that had accumulated the wealth of empires. They seized precious objects accumulated over generations of conquest and tribute. They carried off captives including members of the senatorial aristocracy and even the emperor's own sister Galla Placidia, who would later marry a Gothic king and bear children who would themselves wear crowns. But the Goths did not destroy Rome utterly, did not massacre its population wholesale, did not burn the ancient city to the ground as they might have done had they wished. Alaric was a Christian, baptized in the Arian faith, and he gave orders that churches and those who sheltered in them should be spared from the violence. The basilicas of Peter and Paul became refuges where thousands huddled in safety while the pillaging continued outside. Many treasures were lost, many lives were taken, much suffering was inflicted. But Rome survived as a city even if its pride and its sense of invulnerability had been shattered beyond recovery. Still, the symbolism was devastating beyond measure. Rome had fallen to barbarian invaders for the first time in 800 years, since the Gauls under Brennus had sacked it in 390 BC in an age that seemed remote. The eternal city, Caput Mundi, had been violated by Germanic warriors whom educated Romans still regarded as savages. The blow to Roman pride and confidence was incalculable. The news shocked the entire Roman world. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, wept that the city which had conquered the world had itself been conquered. St. Augustine began his great work, The City of God, partly in response to pagan claims that Rome had fallen because it had abandoned its ancestral gods for the Christian faith. Refugees fled to Africa and the East, carrying tales of horror and loss. The empire would continue, the West would struggle on for another 6 decades, but something had broken that could never be fully repaired. Honorius, by contrast, seemed barely to register the catastrophe. Later writers told a story, perhaps apocryphal but revealing in what it suggested about his character, that when a servant brought him news that Rome had perished, the emperor initially thought the man was referring to a favorite chicken named Roma that he kept as a pet. Only when the misunderstanding was cleared up did Honorius express any concern. Whether true or not, the story captured how contemporaries viewed this emperor who had failed so completely in his fundamental duty to protect the empire entrusted to his care. While the Western Empire reeled from the sack of Rome and struggled to maintain coherence under the feckless Honorius, the Eastern Empire under Theodosius II was developing into something quite different. A more stable and more resilient state that would survive the troubles of the 5th century and endure for another 1,000 years. Theodosius II had been born in 401, the son of Arcadius and his formidable wife Eudoxia. He was only 7 years old when his father died in 408, making him one of the youngest rulers in Roman history and requiring a regency that would shape his entire reign. The dominant figure during Theodosius's minority was his older sister Pulcheria, a woman of remarkable intelligence and iron will who took vows of Christian virginity at the age of 15 and dedicated herself to guiding her brother and managing the imperial household. Pulcheria was elevated to the rank of Augusta in 414, giving her formal authority to match her actual influence, and she would remain a powerful presence at the Constantinople court for decades, shaping religious policy and imperial ceremony according to her deeply pious vision. Under her guidance, the Eastern court became increasingly devoted to Christian observance, its calendar structured around religious festivals, its rituals permeated with sacred significance. Theodosius himself grew into a scholar rather than a warrior, more interested in books and theology than in military campaigns or political intrigue. He was noted for his beautiful handwriting, his generous nature, and his genuine Christian piety. He presided over a court that valued learning and religious devotion, that supported scholars and theologians, that saw imperial power as fundamentally connected to divine favor and Christian righteousness. If he lacked the martial energy of earlier emperors, he also lacked their cruelty and their appetite for conflict. His was a gentler reign than most, marked by attempts at conciliation rather than confrontation wherever possible. The great monument of Theodosius's reign, in literal terms, was the massive system of walls that bears his name and that transformed Constantinople into one of the most formidable fortified cities in the ancient world. The Theodosian walls, constructed in the early 5th century and improved over subsequent decades, consisted of multiple defensive lines protecting the landward approaches to the capital. Inner and outer walls, fortified towers, deep moats, and killing grounds between the barriers created a defensive system that would withstand siege after siege for the next 1,000 years. When Attila's Huns approached Constantinople, when Arab armies battered at the gates, when Crusaders and Turks sought to breach the defenses, these walls held firm century after century. No purely military attack would take Constantinople until 1453. The legal monument of Theodosius's reign was the great codification of Roman law that bears his name. The Theodosian Code, compiled in the 430s and published in 438, gathered together the laws and edicts issued by emperors since Constantine, organizing this vast body of legislation into a coherent system that could be consulted and applied throughout the empire. It was not the only such compilation in Roman history, nor would it be the last, but it represented a major effort to bring order to the accumulated legal inheritance of the imperial centuries. The code would serve as a foundation for later Byzantine law and would influence legal development in the barbarian kingdoms that succeeded the Western Empire. The religious monument of Theodosius's reign was the Council of Ephesus in 431 and the ongoing controversies over the nature of Christ that would divide the Christian world for centuries. These theological disputes, which seem abstract and irrelevant to modern eyes, were matters of passionate importance to 5th century Christians who believed that correct understanding of the faith was essential to salvation. Theodosius navigated these controversies with varying success, sometimes supporting positions that later councils would condemn, sometimes trying to maintain unity among factions that refused to be reconciled. His sister Pulcheria was deeply involved in these religious politics, championing particular theological positions and opposing church leaders who disagreed with her views. In the West, Honorius had died in 423 without legitimate heirs, triggering another succession crisis that required Eastern intervention to resolve satisfactorily. Theodosius eventually supported the claims of Valentinian I, the young son of Constantius III and Galla Placidia. That same Galla Placidia who had been captured by the Visigoths during the sack of Rome and who had endured years of captivity before eventually marrying the Gothic king Athalf, and then, after his assassination, the Roman general Constantius, who briefly wore the purple himself. Valentinian was installed as Western Emperor at Ravenna in 425, still a child of 6 years old, with his formidable mother serving as regent during his minority and the real power exercised by military commanders who competed for dominance over the weakening Western state. Valentinian III would reign for 30 years, longer than any Western emperor since Valentinian I. But his long nominal reign was marked by continuous territorial losses and increasing dependence on barbarian generals who served their own interests and ambitions as much as they served Rome's. The Vandals under their king Glycerius established a powerful maritime kingdom in North Africa, seizing the great city of Carthage in 439 and cutting off the grain supplies that had fed Rome and its population for centuries upon centuries. The Visigoths consolidated their hold on southwestern Gaul and expanded their territory into the Spanish provinces. The Burgundians and Franks carved out territories along the Rhine that owed little more than nominal allegiance to the emperor in Ravenna. With each passing decade, the Western Empire controlled less territory, commanded fewer soldiers, and collected less revenue to pay the soldiers it did have, a downward spiral that no emperor seemed able to reverse regardless of their abilities or intentions. The greatest threat to both halves of the empire during this period came from the Huns under their fearsome king Attila, who unified the nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppes into a terrifying military force that extracted tribute from both Constantinople and Ravenna while raiding deep into imperial territory whenever payments fell behind or diplomacy failed. Attila has come down through history as the scourge of God, a destroyer of cities and killer of nations, though the reality was somewhat more complex than this fearsome reputation might suggest. He was a skilled diplomat as well as a conqueror, manipulating Roman divisions and playing east against west with considerable sophistication. Theodosius paid enormous sums to buy peace from Attila, payments that critics condemned as shameful and unworthy of Roman dignity, but that preserved the wealthy Eastern Empire from the devastation that the Huns inflicted on others who could not or would not pay. It was pragmatic policy, purchasing time and safety while the empire's defensive capabilities improved, and while Attila's attention was directed elsewhere. The Theodosian walls made Constantinople impregnable to any assault the Huns could mount, and so long as tribute flowed, Attila had no reason to test those formidable defenses. When Attila finally invaded the Western Empire in 451, seeking a bride and an excuse for conquest, It was a coalition of Romans under the general Aetius and Visigoths under their king Theodoric that stopped him at the Catalonian plains in Gaul. The engagement was bloody, with Theodoric falling in the fighting and Attila surviving to fight another day. But the Hunnic advance was halted, and Attila withdrew back beyond the Rhine. He invaded Italy the following year, advancing as far as the Po Valley before withdrawing for reasons that remain disputed, whether through disease, lack of supplies, or the famous intervention of Pope Leo, who persuaded him to spare Rome. Attila died in 453, and his empire collapsed almost immediately as his sons quarreled and subjected peoples broke free. Theodosius II died in 450 from injuries sustained in a riding accident, bringing to an end a reign of 42 years that had seen the Eastern Empire survive every challenge while its Western counterpart crumbled. He had not been a great emperor by martial measures, had not led armies in the field or won famous victories. But he had presided over consolidation and institution building that gave the Eastern Empire strength to endure. He was succeeded by Marcian, a capable military officer who married Pulcheria in a nominal union that preserved dynastic continuity while bringing experienced leadership to the throne. Valentinian III survived Theodosius by 5 years, but the Western emperor's position grew ever more precarious as the territories he nominally ruled shrank with each passing year. The man who had actually defended that empire, the general Aetius who had stopped Attila and who had maintained some semblance of Roman authority in the crumbling western provinces, became a victim of imperial jealousy and the whispers of ambitious courtiers. In September of 454, Valentinian personally stabbed Aetius to death during an audience. Convinced by enemies of the general that he was planning to usurp the throne and install himself as emperor. As one contemporary observer reportedly remarked, the emperor had cut off his right hand with his left, destroying the only man capable of defending what remained of his realm. The murder of Aetius removed the last effective defender of the Western Empire and opened the final chapter of Rome's long decline. The murder of Aetius was swiftly followed by the murder of Valentinian himself. In March of 455, soldiers loyal to the dead general took their revenge, cutting down the emperor in the Campus Martius while he practiced archery, ending the Theodosian dynasty in the West and opening 2 decades of chaos during which the Western Empire would pass through the hands of 9 different emperors before its final extinction. With Valentinian's death, the legitimate succession was broken, and the throne became a prize to be seized by whoever had the strength or the cunning to claim it. The first to make that claim was Petronius Maximus, a wealthy and distinguished senator who had served in high offices and who orchestrated Valentinian's assassination partly out of personal grievance, for the emperor had violated his wife, and partly out of ambition for the purple that seemed finally within his grasp. Petronius arranged for his own proclamation as emperor on the 17th of March, 455, and immediately set about trying to legitimize his position through marriage alliances with the murdered emperor's family. He forced Valentinian's widow Eudoxia to marry him, and he married his son to Eudoxia's daughter, hoping that these connections would strengthen his claim to a throne he had seized by violence. But Petronius Maximus had unleashed forces he could not control. According to tradition, Eudoxia, horrified at being forced to marry the man responsible for her husband's death, sent secret messages to Glycerius, the Vandal king in North Africa, inviting him to come and avenge Valentinian and rescue her from her intolerable situation. Whether this story is true or not, Glycerius needed little invitation. He had his own grievances against the new regime, his own ambitions for plunder, and his own fleet capable of carrying his warriors across the Mediterranean to the heart of the weakened empire. When news arrived that the Vandal fleet was approaching Italy, Petronius Maximus attempted to flee Rome rather than organize its defense. But the population, furious at this cowardice and at the disasters his coup had brought upon them, turned on the emperor. On the last day of May, 455, a Roman mob caught Petronius Maximus as he tried to escape the city and killed him, stoning and beating him to death in the streets. His reign had lasted only 2.5 months, barely time to establish any policy or achieve any lasting action. His mutilated body was thrown into the Tiber, and Rome lay open to the Vandals who arrived within days of his death. The Vandal sack of 455 was more thorough and more devastating than Alaric's had been 45 years earlier. For 2 weeks, Glyceric's warriors systematically plundered the city, stripping temples and palaces of treasures that had accumulated over centuries, carrying off everything of value they could find, including the sacred objects that Titus had taken from the temple in Jerusalem almost 400 years before. They took thousands of captives, including the widowed Eudoxia and her daughters, carrying them back to Africa as prizes and hostages. Unlike Alaric, Glyceric felt no need to spare churches or restrain his men from destruction. Rome was thoroughly ransacked, its wealth carried overseas to enrich a barbarian kingdom, its population traumatized by yet another catastrophe. After the Vandal departure, the surviving Roman aristocracy and the military commanders who still held some forces in Italy had to find a new emperor. Their choice fell upon Avitus, a Gallo-Roman nobleman who had served as a general and diplomat and who enjoyed the support of the powerful Visigothic King Theodoric II, whose favor he had cultivated during years of service on the Gothic frontier. Avitus was proclaimed emperor in Gaul in July of 455 with Visigothic backing, then traveled to Italy to claim his throne in what remained of the Western Empire's core territory. Avitus represented a different kind of emperor than the Western Empire had seen before, a man whose power base lay not in Italy but in Gaul, not in the Roman military establishment, but in alliance with barbarian federates who now held the balance of power in the western provinces. His reign, lasting from July 455 to October 456, illustrated how thoroughly the political geography of the West had shifted. The Visigoths were now kingmakers, their support essential for anyone who hoped to hold the purple, their interests shaping imperial policy more than the wishes of the Roman Senate or the needs of the Italian population. The Italian establishment resented this Gallic interloper and his Gothic patrons. More critically, Avitus failed to win the support of Ricimer, a Germanic general of mixed Visigothic and Suevic ancestry who commanded the principal military forces in Italy and who would dominate Western politics for the next 15 years. Ricimer was the son of a Suevic princess and a Visigothic noble, but he had risen through Roman service to become the most powerful military figure in the West. He was also an Arian Christian, which barred him from claiming the imperial title himself given the empire's commitment to Nicene orthodoxy, but he could and would control whoever wore the purple. In 456, Ricimer turned against Avitus. He defeated the emperor's forces in battle, stripped Avitus of his throne, and forced him to accept ordination as a bishop, removing him from secular power while theoretically preserving his life. Avitus died shortly afterward, whether from natural causes, assassination, or the combined effects of defeat and humiliation. His fall established the pattern that would characterize the remaining years of the Western Empire, with barbarian generals making and unmaking emperors according to their own interests while the territory and resources of the empire continued to shrink. After a period without an emperor, Ricimer elevated Majorian to the throne in 457, a choice that seemed promising for the battered Western state. Majorian was a Roman of military background who had served with distinction and who possessed both ability and ambition. Unlike the puppets that Ricimer would later install, Majorian had ideas of his own about how to save the empire and the determination to pursue them. His reign, lasting from 457 to 461, represents the last serious attempt to reverse the Western Empire's decline and restore something of its former strength and territory. Majorian began by reasserting imperial authority in areas that had drifted away during the chaos of recent years. He campaigned in Gaul, forcing the Visigoths to acknowledge Roman supremacy and bringing rebellious regions back under imperial control. He imposed discipline on the administration, attempting to reform the corrupt and inefficient bureaucracy that extracted taxes from a shrinking population while delivering ever less in return. He issued laws aimed at protecting the remaining population from exploitation and at encouraging economic recovery. For a brief moment, it seemed that the Western Empire might yet find a champion capable of arresting its long decline. The centerpiece of Majorian's strategy was an ambitious plan to recover North Africa from the Vandals. Without African grain, Rome could not feed its population. Without African revenues, the empire could not pay its armies. Without African shipping, Roman commerce languished. Majorian gathered a fleet and an army, the largest military expedition the Western Empire had assembled in decades, and prepared to cross the Mediterranean and reclaim the lost provinces. If he could defeat Glycerius and recover Africa, everything might yet be saved. But the expedition ended in disaster before it could properly begin. The Vandal fleet attacked and destroyed Majorian's ships while they lay at anchor in Spanish harbors. The flames that consumed his fleet consumed also his hopes for African recovery. Without those ships, the campaign to retake Africa was impossible. Majorian had to abandon his grand strategy and return to Italy with nothing to show for his efforts but debts and disappointment. Ricimer, who may have viewed Majorian's independence with growing alarm, now moved against him. In August of 461, Ricimer arrested Majorian and stripped him of his imperial dignity. A few days later, the former emperor was executed, the first Western emperor to be formally put to death by his own subjects in more than a century. With Majorian's death, the last realistic chance to save the Western Empire perished as well. The fate of Majorian illuminated the terrible trap in which the Western Empire found itself. To survive, it needed strong leadership and effective military power. But strong leaders threatened the generals who actually commanded the armies, and effective military power required resources that the shrinking empire could no longer provide. Any emperor capable of saving the West was precisely the kind of emperor that Ricimer would not tolerate. And so the empire drifted toward its end, governed by weaklings because the strong were too dangerous to be permitted on the throne. The execution of Majorian also demonstrated how thoroughly the old Roman system had broken down by the middle of the 5th century. In earlier centuries, even bad emperors had usually been treated with at least some respect for the dignity of their office, even when they were being removed from power. Now even that minimal respect had vanished entirely. The imperial dignity meant nothing to men like Ricimer, who held the real military power, and who disposed of emperors as they might dispose of any inconvenient subordinate who had outlived his usefulness. The remaining years of the Western Empire would see this pattern repeated again and again, as Ricimer and his successors installed puppets, discarded them when they proved troublesome or inconvenient, and installed new puppets to take their places. After Majorian's execution, Ricimer installed a new emperor more to his liking, a man named Libius Severus who was content to reign without ruling, to perform the ceremonial functions of the imperial office while leaving actual power in the hands of the barbarian general who had placed him on the throne. Libius Severus was a senator of some standing but no particular distinction, exactly the kind of nonentity that Ricimer preferred. His reign, lasting from November 461 to August 465, was marked by complete subordination to Ricimer's will and by the continued fragmentation of what remained of the Western Empire's authority. The Eastern Emperor Leo refused to recognize Libius Severus as a legitimate colleague, considering him merely Ricimer's puppet and withholding the formal acknowledgement that would have given his reign a patina of legitimacy. This Eastern rejection mattered because the Western Empire increasingly depended on Eastern support, both financial and military, to address threats it could no longer handle with its own diminished resources. Without Eastern recognition, Libius Severus was emperor only of Italy and a few scattered territories that still acknowledged Western authority. The Visigoths, the Burgundians, the Vandals, and other barbarian powers paid him no heed. The reign of Libius Severus saw continued losses and continued impotence. Gaul slipped further from imperial control as the Visigoths expanded their territories, and the remaining Gallo-Roman authorities made their own accommodations with the barbarian powers in their midst. Spain was already lost, divided among Visigoths, Sueves, and various local leaders who recognized no master in distant Ravenna. Africa remained firmly in Vandal hands, its wealth and grain feeding Glyceric's kingdom rather than the hungry population of Rome. The Western Empire had shrunk to little more than Italy itself, and even Italy was defended not by Roman legions, but by barbarian federates whose loyalty depended on regular payment, and whose interests did not necessarily coincide with those of the empire they served. Libius Severus died in August of 465, possibly of natural causes but more likely poisoned, perhaps on Ricimer's orders, or perhaps by other parties who saw advantage in his removal. For 2 years after his death, no Western emperor was appointed at all. Ricimer ruled alone in Italy, negotiating with the Eastern court over the selection of a new puppet while managing the complex politics of a dying state. Finally, in 467, an agreement was reached that brought a new emperor to the west, one chosen not by Ricimer but by the Eastern Emperor Leo, who hoped to install a ruler who might actually accomplish something useful. The new Western emperor was Anthemius, a distinguished aristocrat and military commander who had served with considerable success in the Eastern Empire, and who was connected by marriage to the imperial family in Constantinople through his wife, the daughter of the former Eastern Emperor Marcian. He arrived in Italy in April of 467 with Eastern troops and Eastern money, representing the most serious attempt by the Eastern Empire to shore up its failing Western counterpart since Theodosius the Great had installed Valentinian III 4 decades earlier. Anthemius was meant to be a strong emperor, an emperor who might actually reverse the Western decline and restore the imperial partnership that had once divided the Roman world between cooperating colleagues who shared common interests and common enemies. To bind Ricimer to the new regime, Anthemius gave him his daughter in marriage, creating a family connection that was meant to align the interests of emperor and general in a way that previous relationships had failed to achieve. Ricimer would be not merely a servant of the emperor but his son-in-law, bound by ties of blood as well as politics. It was a reasonable calculation, an attempt to solve through marriage the problem that had destroyed previous emperors. But family ties would prove no more binding than oaths of loyalty when interests diverged and ambitions clashed. The centerpiece of the new Western strategy was yet another attempt to recover North Africa from the Vandals, that same goal that had driven Majorian's failed expedition and that continued to haunt every serious attempt to stabilize the Western Empire. Without Africa, neither East nor West could be truly secure in the long term. Glyceric's fleet raided the coasts of both empires with impunity, appearing without warning to plunder coastal cities and disappearing before any defense could be organized. His kingdom grew fat on stolen wealth, while the empires from which that wealth was stolen grew ever poorer and weaker. And the grain that should have fed Rome and Constantinople instead nourished his warriors and their families in Carthage. The Eastern Emperor Leo committed enormous resources to the expedition of 468, reportedly more than 60,000 pounds of gold according to some sources, an almost unimaginable sum that represented years of carefully accumulated revenue. He built a fleet of over 1,000 ships and gathered an army of perhaps 100,000 men, forces that seemed capable of overwhelming any resistance the Vandals could offer. Command was given to Leo's brother-in-law Basiliscus, a choice that would prove unfortunate, but that seemed reasonable at the time given Basiliscus's family connections and military experience. The campaign of 468 was the largest military operation either empire had undertaken in decades, perhaps the largest either would ever undertake again. Over 1,000 ships carried tens of thousands of soldiers toward Africa, aiming to crush Glycerius once and for all and reunite the Mediterranean under Roman control. But like Majorian's expedition before it, this one ended in catastrophe. The Vandal fleet, aided by fire ships and superior tactics, destroyed the Roman armada off the coast of Africa. Most of the ships were lost, along with their crews and soldiers. The treasure that Leo had spent so lavishly was gone forever. The dream of recovering Africa was dead. The failure of the African expedition shattered the partnership between East and West and undermined Anthemius's position in Italy. He had been installed by Eastern power and Eastern money, and now that power and money had achieved nothing but disaster. Ricimer, who had accepted Anthemius reluctantly and who had been watching for any opportunity to reassert his dominance, began maneuvering against the emperor he had been forced to accept. The two men, barbarian general and Roman emperor, circled each other warily as tensions mounted toward an inevitable confrontation. The conflict between Anthemius and Ricimer erupted into open civil war in 472, the final and most destructive of the conflicts that had plagued the relationship between Western emperors and their barbarian generals. Ricimer gathered his forces, including many of the barbarian federates who looked to him as their patron and paymaster, and marched on Rome where Anthemius had established himself. The general besieged the emperor within the walls of a city that could not adequately defend itself, trapping him in the ancient capital that had become a symbol of imperial decline rather than imperial glory. For months, the siege continued as Rome starved and suffered once again, its remaining population caught between a barbarian army outside the walls and an emperor who could not save them within. The granaries emptied, the markets closed, and hunger stalked the streets of a city that had once fed 1 million inhabitants, but now held only a fraction of that number huddled in the ruins of former greatness. Churches were stripped of their treasures to buy food that could not be found. Civilians died of hunger and disease while soldiers fought over the scraps that remained. And the ancient capital endured yet another catastrophe in what seemed an endless series of 5th-century disasters, each one worse than the last. In July of 472, Ricimer's forces finally broke through Rome's defenses and poured into the city. Anthemius attempted to flee, disguising himself and seeking refuge in a church, but he was discovered and dragged from sanctuary. He was killed by Ricimer's nephew Gundobad, a Burgundian prince who would later become king of his own people and who earned his place in history partly through this act of imperial murder. The man who had been sent from Constantinople to save the Western Empire died as its prisoner, another victim of the impossible politics that made effective imperial rule in the West unachievable by any means anyone had yet discovered. Ricimer had won his final victory over an emperor he considered his rival, but the victory brought him nothing but the ashes of a ruined city and the crumbling remnants of an empire that had almost ceased to exist. Ricimer himself died only weeks later, in August of 472, probably from disease that had been consuming his body even as he consumed the last energies of the dying Western state. His body gave out after decades of scheming and fighting that had done nothing to save the empire he had claimed to serve. He had dominated Western politics for 16 years, making and unmaking emperors according to his own interests, and in the end he left behind nothing but wreckage. 4 Western emperors had died during his ascendancy, 3 of them by violence directly connected to his actions. The territories of the Western Empire had shrunk continuously under his watch, from Gaul to the Alps, from Spain to the Italian peninsula. Whatever his abilities as a soldier and politician, Ricimer had presided over the destruction of the state whose defense was supposedly his purpose. His legacy was collapse. The death of Ricimer left a power vacuum that was quickly filled by his nephew Gundobad, the same man who had executed Anthemius and who now attempted to play the role his uncle had played for so long. Before Ricimer died, he had installed Olybrius as emperor, a Roman aristocrat with impeccable credentials whose wife was a daughter of Valentinian I, giving him a dynastic claim to the throne that few of his recent predecessors could match. But Olybrius, like so many Western emperors of this era, proved to be merely a brief placeholder in the empire's long death spiral. Olybrius reigned for only a few months, from April to November of 472. He died of natural causes, apparently dropsy, one of the few final Western emperors to escape violent death. His brief reign accomplished nothing of note, which was perhaps inevitable given the chaos surrounding his elevation and the impossible circumstances facing anyone who wore the Western purple during these final years. With his death, Gundobad faced the task of finding yet another emperor to legitimize his own position as the true power behind the throne. The choice fell upon Glycerius, an obscure military officer who was elevated to the purple in March of 473 at Ravenna. Little is known about Glycerius's background or abilities. He seems to have been a competent enough administrator during his brief reign, issuing laws and attempting to maintain some semblance of imperial governance. But he was entirely dependent on Gundobad's support, and when that support was withdrawn, his position became untenable. Gundobad soon returned to his homeland to claim the Burgundian throne after his father's death, leaving Glycerius without the military backing that had placed him in power. The Eastern Emperor Leo, watching from Constantinople as the Western Empire continued its disintegration, decided once again to intervene in Western affairs. He appointed his own candidate to the Western throne, a man named Julius Nepos who was related to the Eastern imperial family and who had served as military commander in Dalmatia. In 474, Julius Nepos arrived in Italy with Eastern backing, forcing Glycerius to abdicate without a fight. The deposed emperor was ordained as a bishop and sent to Dalmatia, his imperial career ending in ecclesiastical retirement rather than execution, a relatively merciful fate by the standards of the age. Julius Nepos was the last Western emperor to be recognized by the Eastern court, the last to hold anything like legitimate claim to the imperial succession as the Romans understood it. He was an experienced soldier and administrator, capable enough to have made a decent emperor under better circumstances, a man who might have accomplished something had he inherited an empire worth saving. But the circumstances he faced were beyond salvage by any individual, no matter how talented or determined. The Western Empire had shrunk to Italy and a few scraps of territory elsewhere, a pale shadow of the dominion that had once stretched from Scotland to the Sahara, from Portugal to Mesopotamia. Its treasury was empty, drained by decades of tribute payments and military disasters. Its armies were composed almost entirely of barbarian federates whose loyalty was uncertain at best, and whose interests did not necessarily align with those of the empire they nominally served. Its administrative apparatus had largely collapsed into irrelevance as the territories it was meant to govern fell away one by one to barbarian kingdoms that owed Rome nothing. The dominant military figure in Italy was now Orestes, a Roman who had once served as secretary to Attila the Hun during the great conqueror's campaigns across Europe, and who had later entered Roman service after Attila's death and the collapse of the Hunnic Empire. Orestes had risen through the ranks to command the barbarian troops that constituted what remained of the Western army, the only military force that still answered to imperial authority. He harbored ambitions of his own, this man who had witnessed power at its most naked in the tent of the Scourge of God, and in 475 he turned against Julius Nepos, leading his forces against the emperor and driving him from Italy in a coup that met little resistance. Julius Nepos fled to Dalmatia across the Adriatic, where he continued to claim the imperial title for several more years, maintaining a court in exile and never abandoning his assertion that he was the legitimate Western emperor, even though he could no longer set foot in the Italian peninsula that formed the heart of his supposed domain. Orestes did not claim the throne for himself, perhaps because his long service to Attila made him unacceptable to Roman sensibilities that still mattered to someone, or perhaps because he preferred to rule through a figurehead as Ricimer had done before him. Instead, he elevated his young son to the purple, a boy named Romulus who was given the imperial title Augustulus, Little Augustus, a diminutive that reflected both his youth and perhaps the diminished state of the empire he nominally ruled. Romulus Augustulus was probably about 14 years old when he became emperor in October of 475, the last in the long line of rulers that stretched back 5 centuries to the great Augustus himself. The reign of Romulus Augustulus was brief and empty of any real content. He issued no laws of significance, commanded no armies, made no decisions of consequence. He was a boy wearing purple robes in a palace at Ravenna, while his father Orestes wielded whatever power remained in the crumbling western state. The barbarian troops who constituted the only military force available to the Western government served Orestes, not the child emperor, and their loyalty depended entirely on continued payment and the promise of land that Orestes had difficulty fulfilling. Those barbarian troops, a mixed force of various Germanic peoples who had entered Roman service over the preceding decades, and who represented the last remnants of what had once been the mightiest military force the ancient world had ever known, grew restless as Orestes failed to deliver on his promises to them. They demanded land in Italy, a third of the peninsula's territory to be divided among them as their reward for years of service to an empire that seemed to have nothing else left to give. It was not an unreasonable demand by the standards of what other barbarian groups had received elsewhere in the former Western Empire during this turbulent century. The Visigoths had their flourishing kingdom in Gaul and Spain, ruling over Roman subjects who had become their taxpayers. The Vandals had wealthy Africa and its grain fields. The Burgundians had their territories along the Rhone. Why should the soldiers who had served Rome so long and so faithfully, who had fought and bled for emperors they barely knew, not receive similar compensation for their sacrifices? Orestes refused their demands, perhaps believing he could maintain control without making such substantial concessions, perhaps simply unable to deliver what they asked given the political and practical constraints he faced. The Italian landowners who supported him would not willingly surrender a third of their estates to barbarian soldiers, and Orestes may have calculated that his position depended more on their goodwill than on the satisfaction of his troops. If so, it was a fatal miscalculation. The barbarian troops, feeling betrayed by a leader who would not fulfill his obligations to them, turned to one of their own for leadership. His name was Odoacer, a Germanic warrior of uncertain tribal origin, perhaps Syrian or Ruggian, or of mixed heritage from the many peoples who had migrated across Europe during these turbulent decades, who had served in the Roman military for years, and who now emerged as the spokesman and champion for the discontented soldiers. Under Odoacer's leadership, the barbarians rose against Orestes. The rebellion was swift and brutal in its execution. Orestes was captured and executed in August of 476, paying with his life for promises he could not keep to men who had trusted him to deliver what he had offered. His brother Paulus died defending Ravenna against the barbarian forces, fighting to the end for a cause that was already lost. And young Romulus Augustulus, the boy emperor who had never truly ruled anything, who had been a puppet and a figurehead from the first moment the purple was draped across his narrow shoulders, found himself alone and unprotected as Odoacer's warriors took control of the imperial capital. The last Western Roman emperor awaited his fate in a palace that had belonged to rulers stretching back through centuries of Roman history, a history that was now coming to its final chapter. Odoacer chose mercy, or perhaps simply saw no advantage in killing a harmless child who posed no threat to his power and whose death would accomplish nothing useful. He deposed Romulus Augustulus but allowed him to live, sending him to a villa in Campania with a pension that would support him in comfortable retirement for the rest of his days. The boy who had briefly worn the purple, who had borne the names of Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor, would live out his remaining years in obscurity, the last emperor of the West fading from history's view as completely as the empire he had nominally ruled. His ultimate fate remains unknown to us. Some sources suggest he may have lived into the 6th century, a forgotten figure dwelling in the shadow of a vanished empire, but certainty is impossible across the distance of so many centuries. He simply disappears from the historical records, as the Western Empire itself was disappearing into memory and legend and the long twilight of the post-Roman world. The year 476 has been remembered as the end of the Western Roman Empire, the date that textbooks cite as marking the transition from ancient to medieval history, the moment when the classical world gave way to the Dark Ages. And yet to those who lived through it, the events of that year may not have seemed so momentous, so clearly the end of an era that had shaped the world for half a millennium. Emperors had come and gone with numbing frequency in recent decades. Barbarian generals had dominated the politics of the Western court for a generation. The actual governance of what remained of Roman territory had long since devolved to local authorities, to bishops and landowners and urban councils who managed affairs as best they could while the imperial center grew ever weaker and more irrelevant. Odoacer, having deposed Romulus Augustulus, did not establish himself as a new Western emperor or attempt to found a dynasty of barbarian rulers wearing Roman purple. Instead, he did something more telling about the changed realities of the post-Roman world. He sent the imperial regalia, the diadem and purple robes that symbolized Western imperial authority, to Constantinople, to the Eastern Emperor Zeno, who still maintained the Roman state in its wealthier and better defended half. The message was clear enough. There would be no more Western emperors. The fiction of a divided but unified Roman Empire would give way to a new reality in which the East alone continued the Roman tradition, while the West became something different, something barbarian kingdoms would make of it in the centuries to come. Zeno accepted the regalia and the implicit acknowledgement that he was now the sole Roman emperor, though the practical implications of this recognition were limited. He could not project power into Italy, could not challenge Odoacer's control of the peninsula, could not restore the Western Empire by force of arms. He granted Odoacer the title of patrician, recognizing him as a legitimate authority governing Italy on behalf of the empire, even though everyone understood that this was a polite fiction covering the reality of barbarian rule. Julius Nepos, still claiming to be the rightful Western emperor from his exile in Dalmatia, was technically the legitimate ruler whom Zeno should have supported. But Zeno made no effort to restore him, and when Julius Nepos was finally murdered in 480, the last pretender to the Western throne passed from the scene without Eastern intervention on his behalf. Odoacer ruled Italy for 17 years, from 476 to 493, governing it with reasonable competence and maintaining many of the administrative structures that had characterized Roman rule. He collected taxes, maintained roads, administered justice, and preserved much of the existing social order, even as the political framework that had supported it disappeared. The Roman Senate continued to meet, aristocratic families continued to manage their estates, and the church continued to grow in wealth and influence. Life for most inhabitants of Italy probably changed less than we might expect from such a dramatic political transformation. The rhythms of agriculture, the concerns of commerce, the structures of local community continued much as they had before, even as the great edifice of imperial government crumbled away above them. But if life continued, the Roman Empire in the West did not. What ended in 476 was not Roman civilization, which would persist in transformed forms for centuries, but Roman political unity, the idea that the Mediterranean world and its hinterlands formed a single state under a single ruler. The western provinces, already fractured among various barbarian kingdoms, would never again be reunited under Roman authority despite later attempts by Eastern emperors to recover what had been lost. The dream of universal empire, of a single political order embracing the civilized world, gave way to the reality of competing kingdoms, each with its own king, its own laws, its own interests. The causes of Rome's fall have been debated for as long as people have written history, and the debate continues today among scholars who bring ever more sophisticated analytical tools to bear on this ancient question. Edward Gibbon famously blamed Christianity and barbarism in his monumental Decline and Fall, arguing that otherworldly religion had sapped Roman civic virtue, while Germanic peoples had overwhelmed weakened defenses with their vigorous martial culture. Modern historians have proposed countless other explanations since Gibbon wrote, from lead poisoning in Roman water pipes to climate change that disrupted agricultural patterns, from economic decline driven by inflation and taxation to military overextension across frontiers too vast to defend. From plague that depopulated cities and legions to moral decay that supposedly corrupted Roman character. The truth almost certainly lies in some combination of these and other factors that varied in importance across different regions and different centuries of Roman decline. A perfect storm of challenges accumulating over generations that eventually proved too much for any political system to survive, no matter how resilient or adaptable. Perhaps the simplest and most compelling explanation is that the Western Roman Empire became too expensive to maintain relative to the resources available to support it. Defending thousands of miles of frontier against increasingly organized barbarian confederations required armies that consumed revenues faster than a shrinking economy could provide them. When the armies could not be paid, they could not be maintained. When they could not be maintained, the frontiers could not be defended. When the frontiers fell, the tax base shrank further, making the next round of military expenditure even harder to finance. The empire entered a death spiral from which there was no escape, a feedback loop of declining resources and declining security that fed on itself until the system collapsed entirely. The barbarians who inherited the Western Empire were not the savage destroyers that later Roman propaganda and medieval legend made them out to be. They were peoples who had lived alongside the empire for centuries, who had served in its armies, who had absorbed much of its culture even as they maintained their own distinct identities. When they established their kingdoms on former Roman territory, they generally preserved what they could of Roman administration and Roman learning, recognizing that these represented valuable tools for governing complex societies. The transition from Roman to barbarian rule was often more gradual and more collaborative than dramatic narratives of conquest and destruction suggest. What the fall of the Western Empire did destroy was the political and economic unity that had bound the Mediterranean world together, since Augustus had established his principate 5 centuries earlier. Trade routes that had carried goods from Britain to Egypt now ended at political boundaries that had not existed before. Administrative traditions that had maintained roads and aqueducts and grain supplies now depended on the resources and priorities of individual kingdoms rather than an imperial system. The cultural unity that had spread Latin language and Roman law across half a continent now fragmented into regional variations that would eventually become the distinct nations of medieval and modern Europe. The Eastern Roman Empire continued, of course, surviving the 5th century catastrophe that destroyed its Western counterpart, and enduring for another 1,000 years until Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. This Byzantine civilization, as later historians would call it, preserved much of the Roman heritage through the medieval centuries, transmitting classical learning to future generations and maintaining political traditions that claimed direct descent from Augustus and his successors. In some sense, Rome never fell at all but merely transformed, its center shifting from the Tiber to the Bosphorus, its language changing from Latin to Greek, its character evolving from classical to medieval while retaining an essential continuity with the ancient past. But the Western Empire, the Empire of Rome and Ravenna, of Gaul and Spain and Britain and Africa, that empire ended in the late 5th century and would never rise again. Its passing marked the close of an era in human history, the end of a political experiment that had unified the Mediterranean world for half a millennium under a single government. What came after would be different in fundamental ways, would be medieval rather than ancient, would be the world of feudal kingdoms and the Catholic Church rather than provinces and legions. The Roman emperors were gone from the West, their memory preserved in stories and ruins, their legacy embedded in languages and laws and institutions that would shape European civilization for centuries to come. And so our journey through the history of the Roman emperors draws toward its close. From Augustus, who transformed the dying republic into an empire that would endure for centuries, to Romulus Augustulus, the boy who bore the names of Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor, but who ruled over nothing but shadows and memories, we have traced the long arc of Roman imperial power through triumph and disaster, through 5 centuries of history that shaped the world we inherit today. Rest now, and let these names settle into your memory like leaves falling on an autumn afternoon, each one part of a story that connects us to the ancient past and reminds us that even the mightiest empires are mortal, that all things pass, and that what endures is the human spirit that creates civilizations and mourns their passing. We have traveled far together through the centuries, from the sunlit days of Augustus when the empire was young and strong, through the long twilight of decline that ended in the quiet deposition of a boy emperor named for Rome's legendary founders. We have met emperors wise and foolish, cruel and kind, competent and catastrophically incompetent. We have witnessed civil wars and foreign invasions, religious transformations and administrative reforms, plagues and persecutions, and the slow crumbling of an order that once seemed eternal. The story of the Roman emperors is, in many ways, the story of how human beings attempt to govern themselves, to create order out of chaos, to build institutions that might outlast the fragile lives of those who create them. The first emperors we encountered were the architects of a new kind of state, men who transformed the forms of the Roman Republic while claiming to preserve them. Augustus, that master of political theater, created an empire by pretending he had not created one, and his successors inherited both his power and his pretensions. Some, like Tiberius and Claudius, proved capable administrators despite personal flaws that scandalized their contemporaries and delighted later gossips. Others, like Caligula and Nero, became bywords for tyranny and excess, their reigns remembered as cautionary tales about the dangers of unlimited power in unstable hands. The year of the 4 emperors taught the Roman world a lesson it would relearn many times over the following centuries, that the succession to supreme power was the Achilles heel of the imperial system. When Augustus died, his carefully prepared successor took his place without bloodshed. When the Julio-Claudian line ended, armies and generals competed for the throne in a civil war that killed thousands and reminded everyone that the empire rested ultimately on military force, not legal right or hereditary succession. This pattern would repeat through the centuries, periods of stability under established dynasties, followed by violent struggles when those dynasties ended or were overthrown. The Flavians and the 5 good emperors showed what the empire could achieve under capable leadership. Vespasian restored order after civil war, Titus and Domitian maintained it with varying degrees of success. And then came the remarkable century of Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, each choosing his successor on the basis of merit rather than blood relationship. Under these emperors, the empire reached its greatest extent and its highest prosperity, a vast realm stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia, from the Sahara to the forests of Germany, bound together by Roman law and Roman roads and the common culture of the Mediterranean world. But even in these golden years, the seeds of future troubles were being sown. The frontiers that Trajan extended and Hadrian fortified required constant defense against peoples who pressed ever more insistently against Roman boundaries. The economy that supported the imperial system depended on conquest and slaves, on the exploitation of resources that were not infinite. The military that defended the empire was changing, incorporating more barbarian soldiers whose loyalties might be divided. And the old civic religion that had bound Romans together was giving way to new faiths, including one that began with a crucified preacher in Palestine and that would eventually conquer the empire that had executed him. The 3rd century brought crisis after crisis, a cascade of disasters that nearly destroyed the Roman state. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying frequency, their reigns measured in months rather than years, their deaths usually violent. Plague reduced the population, inflation destroyed the currency, and barbarian invasions pierced frontiers that could no longer be adequately defended. For a generation, it seemed the empire might simply disintegrate, breaking apart into regional fragments that would go their separate ways and leave the Roman unity behind as a memory rather than a reality. Yet the empire survived. Diocletian's reforms created a new administrative structure that could manage the vast territories more effectively. Constantine's embrace of Christianity gave the empire a new ideological foundation to replace the dying paganism of earlier centuries. The empire was transformed, but it endured, its center shifting from Rome to Constantinople, its character changing from classical to medieval, while retaining the essential claim to be the legitimate continuation of the Roman state that Augustus had founded. The 4th century saw the empire divided between multiple emperors, united under Julian's brief attempt to restore paganism, and then divided again between the sons of Theodosius. The Gothic crisis that culminated at Adrianople demonstrated that the old Roman military system could no longer guarantee security against barbarian confederations that had learned from centuries of contact with Rome and that now possessed the organization and the numbers to challenge Roman armies. In open battle, the 5th century brought the final collapse in the West. One by one, the western provinces fell away, conquered by Vandals and Visigoths and Burgundians and Franks who established their own kingdoms on territory that had been Roman for centuries. The Western emperors became puppets of barbarian generals, their authority a polite fiction that fooled no one. And finally, in 476, even the fiction ended, and the last boy emperor surrendered his purple to a Germanic chieftain who had no use for the title that had once made men masters of the known world. The legacy of the Roman emperors extends far beyond the political events of their reigns, reaching into every aspect of Western civilization and continuing to shape our world in ways we often fail to recognize. The legal system they developed, refined over centuries and codified most completely under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, became the foundation of civil law in much of Europe and continues to influence legal thinking and practice to this day. When modern lawyers speak of contracts and property rights, of inheritance and criminal procedure, they often use concepts and terminology that trace directly back to Roman jurists working in the service of Roman emperors. The languages they spread across their vast domains, Latin in the West and Greek in the East, evolved into the Romance languages of modern Europe, including Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, languages spoken today by hundreds of millions of people around the world. Latin provided the vocabulary for science, medicine, law, and religion, and continues to be studied as the key to understanding classical civilization and the foundations of Western thought. The administrative structures they created, from provinces to dioceses, shaped the organization of both church and state for centuries after the empire itself had passed away, and many of our modern governmental concepts derive from Roman practices developed during the imperial centuries. The buildings they constructed, from the Colosseum to Hagia Sophia, from the Pantheon to the Great Walls of Constantinople, still stand as monuments to Roman engineering skill and Roman imperial ambition. The roads they built with such care and engineering skill, designed to move armies quickly from one crisis to another across the vast distances of the empire, became the arteries of medieval commerce and formed the basis for transportation networks that exist to this day. The cities they founded or expanded, from London to Vienna to Belgrade, remain important centers of population and power in the modern world. Most profoundly, perhaps, the Roman emperors created an idea that has never quite died, the idea of universal empire, of a single political order encompassing the civilized world under a single ruler and a single law. Later emperors, from Charlemagne to Napoleon to Hitler, claim to be restoring or continuing the Roman tradition, and the very word emperor derives from the Latin imperator that Roman generals earned through victory in battle. The dream of Rome continues to haunt the European imagination, an ideal of unity and order and civilization that remains powerful even as the empire itself recedes ever further into the past. Now our story reaches its end at last, though the echoes of Rome continue to sound through the centuries that separate us from those final Western emperors who watched helplessly as their world crumbled around them. We have walked together through 500 years of history, from the transformation of the Roman Republic into an empire that would shape the ancient world, to the fall of the West when barbarian kingdoms rose on the ruins of Roman power. We have traveled from Augustus, that cunning political genius who created something new while claiming to restore something old, to Romulus Augustulus, the boy who bore such famous names but ruled over nothing but shadows and fading memories of greatness that was no more. May these stories stay with you as you rest tonight. May the names and deeds of emperors settle gently into your memory, like sediment drifting to the floor of a still and peaceful pond. And may you carry with you some sense of the vast sweep of history that connects us across the ages to that ancient world that seems so distant, yet shaped so much of what we are today. Sleep well now, and know that though empires fall and dynasties end, the human story continues onward, always beginning again even as it reaches each ending, always building new civilizations even as the old ones pass into memory and legend and the long silence of forgotten centuries. Before we close our eyes and let sleep carry us away into dreams, let us linger a little longer with some of the stranger, sadder, and more peculiar stories from the long history of Rome's emperors. These are the tales that ancient historians love to tell and that their readers love to read, the scandalous anecdotes and bizarre episodes that may or may not be entirely true, but that reveal what Romans thought about power and those who wielded it in their name. Some of these stories are probably inventions, hostile propaganda transformed into accepted fact by centuries of repetition and the natural human love of a good scandal. Others may contain grains of truth exaggerated beyond recognition by writers seeking to entertain as much as to inform. And some, perhaps, happened exactly as the ancient sources described them, reminders that human nature in all its strangeness has not changed much across the millennia that separate us from those distant days. We might begin with the Emperor Tiberius, who spent the last decade of his long reign on the island of Capri, rarely if ever venturing back to Rome, governing the empire through letters and through the feared Praetorian prefect Sejanus until that ambitious officer overreached his position and was destroyed in a spectacular fall from grace. The ancient historian Suetonius filled his account of Tiberius with tales of debauchery and cruelty practiced on that island retreat. Stories so lurid and so detailed that later generations have debated endlessly whether they represent historical truth or the imaginings of hostile writers determined to blacken the memory of an unpopular emperor who had made many enemies among the senatorial class. Whatever the truth behind these accusations, the image of the reclusive emperor watching his vast empire from a cliff-top villa, surrounded by astrologers and objects of pleasure, while Rome itself went on without him, has haunted the historical imagination ever since. Caligula provided endless material for scandalous stories, from his supposed plan to make his horse Incitatus a consul to his claims of divine status that offended Roman sensibilities, trained to view such assertions as the mark of Eastern despotism rather than proper Roman behavior. He reportedly had incestuous relationships with his sisters, murdered guests at dinner parties for his amusement, and once declared war on the sea god Neptune, ordering his soldiers to collect seashells as spoils of victory. How much of this is true remains impossible to determine. Caligula's reign was brief, and his successors had every reason to paint him as a monster whose removal was justified. But the stories themselves reveal Roman anxieties about what unlimited power might do to a human mind. Nero's excesses have become proverbial, though the famous story that he fiddled while Rome burned is almost certainly false, since the fiddle had not yet been invented and Nero was actually many miles away when the Great Fire broke out. But his persecution of Christians, his murder of his mother Agrippina, his execution of his wife Octavia, and his grandiose artistic pretensions all provided ample material for hostile accounts that have shaped his reputation for 2,000 years. When he finally died by his own hand, abandoned by his guards and condemned by the Senate, he supposedly lamented what an artist the world was losing, a final moment of self-dramatization from an emperor who had always seen himself as a performer on the world's greatest stage. The year of the 4 emperors produced its own crop of bizarre moments. Vitellius, the glutton emperor, was said to have spent enormous sums on elaborate banquets while the empire convulsed in civil war around him. When his enemies finally caught him, they paraded him through the streets of Rome, pelting him with filth and abuse before killing him and throwing his body into the Tiber. Galba, the elderly emperor who preceded him, was so stingy that he refused to pay the soldiers the donative they had been promised, a fatal miscalculation that led directly to his assassination in the Roman Forum. The Emperor Domitian was said to spend hours alone in a private room catching flies and stabbing them with a stylus, behavior that struck his contemporaries as evidence of an unstable and dangerous personality lurking beneath the surface of imperial majesty. When someone asked if anyone was with the emperor, a courtier reportedly replied that not even a fly was with him, a dark joke that circulated through the palace corridors and captured something of the paranoid isolation that characterized Domitian's later reign. He trusted no one and saw conspiracies everywhere, surrounding himself with mirrors so that no assassin could approach unseen, until a real conspiracy finally claimed his life in a bloody palace coup. His assassination was greeted with joy by the Senate whose members he had terrorized, but with genuine grief by the army whose soldiers he had treated well, a division that would characterize Roman politics for centuries to come. Commodus, the son of the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, provided some of the most colorful material for ancient scandalmongers, his reign a seemingly endless source of stories that later generations would read with horrified fascination. He renamed Rome after himself, calling it the colony of Commodus, and added his name to the months of the year. He appeared in the arena as a gladiator, fighting from a raised platform where he could kill exotic animals and defeated gladiators without any risk to his imperial person, then charging the treasury enormous fees for his performances. He identified himself with the hero Hercules, appearing in public dressed in a lion skin and carrying a club, demanding to be worshipped as a god made flesh. He was strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus, ending a reign that had begun with such promise and deteriorated into what his contemporaries considered madness and disgrace. The contrast between the thoughtful Marcus Aurelius and his theatrical, violent son has puzzled historians ever since, a reminder that even the best parents cannot always pass their virtues to their children. Elagabalus, the teenage priest-emperor from Syria, brought scandal to new heights during his brief reign in the early 3rd century. He introduced the worship of his Syrian sun-god to Rome, married and divorced multiple times, including allegedly to a Vestal virgin, and was said to have engaged in behavior that shocked even Romans accustomed to imperial eccentricity. His grandmother and mother, who had engineered his rise to power, eventually turned against him and supported his cousin and successor Alexander Severus, and Elagabalus was killed at 18, his body thrown into the sewer, his memory condemned by a senate that wanted to forget he had ever existed. The later empire produced its own share of strange stories and peculiar characters who have echoed down through history. The Emperor Julian, known to Christians as the apostate because he was the last pagan ruler who tried to reverse the Christian transformation of the Roman state, was said to have kept such a magnificently large beard that insects nested in it, a detail that Christian writers included to mock his attempt to revive classical philosophy and traditional religion, and to portray him as an unkempt eccentric rather than a serious reformer. Valentinian I died from a rage-induced stroke while yelling at barbarian ambassadors who had displeased him with their insolent demands, a spectacular exit for a man known throughout his life for a violent temper that terrified those who served him. Honorius, the emperor who presided over the sack of Rome by Alaric's Visigoths, was said to have been more concerned about his pet chickens than about the fall of the Eternal City, though this story may be apocryphal. And finally, there is Romulus Augustulus himself, the boy emperor whose very name seemed like a cruel joke played by history on the failing Western Empire. Romulus had been the legendary founder of Rome, Augustus the founder of the empire. To bear both names and to preside over nothing but the final collapse of Western Roman power was an irony that ancient writers appreciated and that we can still recognize across the distance of 15 centuries. He survived his deposition, was sent to a villa in southern Italy with a pension, and simply disappeared from history, the last emperor of Rome fading into obscurity as the world he had nominally ruled transformed into something new. These stories, whether true or false or somewhere in between, remind us that the emperors were human beings, subject to all the weaknesses and eccentricities and strange obsessions that flesh is heir to in every age. Power magnified their flaws as well as their virtues, placing them under a spotlight that illuminated every peculiarity and every excess, while also giving them the means to indulge appetites that ordinary mortals must restrain. The historical record preserved both the good and the bad in equal measure, passed down through centuries by writers who found scandal as interesting as virtue and perhaps more entertaining to record. Let these tales drift through your thoughts as you settle towards sleep, strange echoes from a distant time when men wore purple and ruled the known world, when the fate of millions depended on the character and the sanity of whoever happened to sit on the imperial throne. These were real people who lived and died, who loved and feared and schemed, and sometimes lost their way amid the temptations of unlimited power. Their stories are part of our inheritance from the ancient world, reminders that even in the most exalted positions, humanity remains fundamentally human, capable of greatness and folly, of wisdom and madness, of creating empires and watching them fall.